On a quiet winter morning in Ellington, Connecticut, a mother of two walked through her front door and into a sequence of events that would haunt this community for a decade. Her husband would tell the police a story of terror, a masked intruder, a violent struggle, and a narrow escape. At first, the tragedy seemed like a random act of cruelty, a nightmare that could happen to anyone. But inside that house, truth wasn't found in the shattered glass or the zip ties. It was found in the silence. Because while the world looked for a ghost in camouflage, a small device on Connie Dabate's wrist was quietly recording a different reality. This is a story about the fragility of trust, the power of routine, and the exact moment a timeline stopped making sense. To understand how Connie Dabate died, you first have to understand how she lived. Connie didn't live a life of chaos or unpredictability. She lived a life of deliberate, beautiful consistency. In the town of Ellington, Connie was a constant. She was the pharmaceutical representative who never missed a meeting, the mother who never forgot a school spirit day, the friend who was always exactly where she said she would be. To Connie, routine wasn't a cage, it was her love language. It was how she kept her world and the lives of her two young sons spinning on a perfect axis. Every morning followed a script. The alarm at the same hour. The preparation of school lunches. The ritual of the Fitbit, strapping it on like a piece of armor before heading to her local YMCA for a spin class. She tracked her steps not just for fitness but because she valued the data of her own life. She liked knowing that her efforts were being counted. On December 23, 2015, 2 days before Christmas, that routine should have been her greatest comfort. The house was decorated. The gifts were wrapped. The schedule for the day was set in stone. But there is a specific danger in being a person of habit. When a person who is never late suddenly disappears, the silence is louder. When a person who follows a path suddenly deviates, the tracks left behind are deeper. Friends described Connie as the glue of the family, the one who managed the calendars, the finances, and the emotional temperature of the home. She was a woman who moved through the world with a predictable, steady heartbeat. We often think of our daily routines as mundane, the boring repetitions of a life well lived. But in a courtroom, those repetitions become evidence. In a murder investigation, a boring life is a transparent one. Because Connie Dabate was so consistent. Because her life followed such a steady rhythmic pulse, even a deviation of 5 minutes would later become an indictment. The story Richard Dabate told required Connie to be a victim of timing. But as investigators would soon learn, Connie's own body was keeping a much more accurate record than the man she shared her bed with. Because when your life is measured in consistency, the truth is written in the minutes you leave behind. Connie Dabate wasn't just a part of her community, for many she was the community. Born Connie Margata, she grew up in Stafford Springs, Connecticut, raised in a home where values like diligence, honesty, and an unwavering commitment to family weren't just spoken, they were lived. Her parents instilled in her a quiet strength, a sense of responsibility that would define her from a young age. She carried herself with a composure that inspired trust. Whether it was in her school years, where she excelled academically and cultivated friendships that would last a lifetime, or later in her professional career. She earned a degree from Central Connecticut State University, a testament to her ambition and her belief in building a stable future. Connie found her calling as a pharmaceutical sales representative for Pfizer. It was a role that perfectly suited her meticulous nature and her genuine ability to connect with people. She didn't just sell products, she built relationships. Colleagues described her as dedicated, organized, and deeply professional. She was the one who could always be counted on, the person who made sure every detail was handled, every appointment kept, every promise honored. It wasn't just a job, it was another facet of her consistent, reliable character. Beyond her career, Connie was the bedrock of her social circle. She was the friend who organized the gatherings, remembered birthdays, and offered a listening ear without judgment. Her loyalty was fierce, her empathy profound. These weren't grand, dramatic gestures. They were the small, consistent acts of kindness that define a truly supportive friend. She invested herself wholly in these connections, creating a network of people who respected and deeply loved her. But perhaps her most important role, the one that truly anchored her existence, was that of a mother. Her sons were her universe. Every decision, every plan, every moment of her carefully structured day revolved around their well-being and happiness. She nurtured them, educated them, and instilled in them the same values of responsibility and kindness that she had inherited. She was the steady hand, the guiding light, the emotional compass that kept her family aligned. What many didn't realize, however, was the immense emotional labor Connie carried. Her reliability was often a silent burden. She was the one everyone leaned on, the one who absorbed the anxieties and pressures of those around her, quietly processing them, always striving to maintain a calm and reassuring presence. She was the problem solver, the peacekeeper, the one who often put the needs of others before her own. This wasn't a flaw, it was a testament to her generous spirit, but it also painted a picture of a woman who was constantly giving, constantly balancing. Connie was, in essence, the center of gravity for her entire world. The person around whom everything else rotated. Her unwavering dependability was her most defining characteristic, the quality that made her indispensable to her family, her friends, and her colleagues. And it was precisely this quality, her profound, absolute dependability, that made her sudden, inexplicable absence on that December morning impossible to reconcile. Because to everyone who knew her, Connie Dabate was not just a person, she was a promise. And that promise, shattered without warning, left a void that no one could comprehend. While Connie was the emotional anchor of the home, Richard "Rick" Dabate was its narrator. To understand Richard is to understand a man who was deeply comfortable in the spotlight of his own life. Raised in a stable middle-class environment in Connecticut, Rick grew up with a sense of social ease that many envied. He was charismatic, well-spoken, and possessed an innate confidence, the kind of man who could walk into a room of strangers and leave with a dozen new friends. But as those close to the family would later reflect, Richard's confidence wasn't just a personality trait, it was a tool. He had a profound need to explain, to clarify, and to frame the world around him. In his professional life as an IT professional, he was the guy who fixed the glitches, the one who understood the systems that others found confusing. He was a man of logic, data, and sequences. And yet, when you looked closely at the sequence of his personal life, the logic began to feel curated. There was a particular comfort Richard felt when speaking to authority. Whether it was police officers, neighbors, or colleagues, Rick didn't just answer questions, he offered narratives. He was helpful to a fault, providing detail upon detail, often before he was even asked. But even early on there were cracks. Small hairline fractures in the persona. Friends occasionally noticed a strange emotional distance, a flatness that would appear during moments of high stress. While Connie was a woman of deep, visible feeling, Rick often seemed to be observing his own life from a slight distance, as if he were a character in a movie he was also directing. Then there were the contradictions. Nothing major, not at first. A story about a work meeting that shifted slightly when retold. A detail about a financial decision that didn't quite align with the bank statements. These weren't red flags, they were pink ones. The kind of inconsistencies that friends brush off because, on the surface, the Dabates were the picture of suburban success. What no one saw, what Connie, in her unwavering trust, couldn't have imagined, was that Richard was managing a compartmentalized existence. Even before that fateful December morning, there were parts of Richard's life that rarely overlapped. He was a man living in silos. There was the Richard who was the doting father, the Richard who was the IT expert, and then there was a third version. A version that lived in the digital shadows, in the sent folders of private accounts, and in the quiet moments when the house was asleep. He was a man who believed he could maintain the walls between these lives indefinitely. He was confident that as long as he remained the narrator, he could control the ending of the story. At the time, those who saw these small separations thought nothing of them. They were just quirks of a complex man. No one knew that these tiny ignored gaps in his story were the very places where a much darker truth was beginning to grow. And no one knew just how much those separations would later matter. Every marriage has a public face and a private reality. For Connie and Rick Dabate, the public face was flawless. They had met years earlier, a pairing that seemed to make perfect sense to everyone who knew them. She was the organized, grounded heart. He was the charismatic, tech-savvy engine. They were two ambitious professionals building a life in a zip code that signaled they had arrived. They bought the house on Birchview Drive, a colonial-style home in a neighborhood where the lawns were manicured and the Christmas lights were always hung straight. It was a house built for forever. But forever is a heavy weight to carry. As the years passed, the shared responsibilities of parenting two young boys began to fill the spaces where romance once lived. There was the constant shuffle of daycare, soccer practices, and work schedules. On the surface, they were a high-functioning team. They communicated in logistics, texts about grocery lists, emails about mortgage payments, quick handoffs of the children in the driveway. But beneath the logistical efficiency, the tectonic plates were shifting. Financial stress began to seep into the foundation like a quiet leak. In suburban Connecticut, maintaining a certain lifestyle requires a relentless income, and Richard, despite his confidence, was feeling the squeeze. There were credit card balances that stayed high and a life insurance policy on Connie that felt less like a safety net and more like a line item on a ledger. Yet there was no big fight. No neighbors heard shouting. No police were called to the home for domestic disputes. This was a quiet erosion. Emotional distance in a marriage doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like politeness. It looks like two people being very careful not to touch the third rail of their relationship. Rick buried himself in his IT work and his digital world. Connie buried herself in her children and her routine. They were living in a state of functional distance. They shared a bed, a bank account, and a last name, but they were no longer sharing a vision of the future. Connie was leaning into the stability of their routine, believing that if she just kept the gears turning, the marriage would stay on track. Richard, however, was looking for an exit, or perhaps, a way to start over without losing the world he had built. From the outside, the marriage appeared functional. It looked like the American dream in midwinter. But internally, the relationship had become an act of constant, exhausting balance. And the problem with a life built on balance is that it only takes one unexpected wait, one secret, one decision, one moment of panic, to tilt the entire structure. And balance, once disrupted, is almost impossible to restore. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with lying. It isn't just about the words you say, it's about the architecture you have to build to support them. While Connie was moving through her days with a transparency that left no shadows, Richard was becoming a master of the hidden room. For over a year, Richard Dabate had been living a second life, one that wasn't just a fleeting distraction, but a fully realized, separate reality. He had entered into a long-term relationship with another woman, a relationship that had moved far beyond the boundaries of a simple affair. This was a life built in the gaps of his primary one. It existed in the business trips that weren't for business. It lived in the burner phones, the secondary email addresses, and the carefully timed late nights at the office. To his mistress, Richard wasn't just a boyfriend. He was a man allegedly in the process of disentangling himself from a marriage that was already over. He was promising a future that was, in reality, a mathematical impossibility. But in late 2015, the walls of these silos began to thin. The separate life was no longer staying in its lane. The mistress was pregnant. Suddenly, the logic Richard relied on was failing him. A baby isn't a secret you can delete from a hard drive. It is a biological ticking clock. Richard was now facing a deadline that even his most polished narrative couldn't explain away. He was a man trapped between two worlds. One where he was the respected suburban father and provider, and another where a new life was arriving, demanding its own space, its own name, and its own financial support. The financial strain was no longer a quiet leak, it was a flood. Richard was trying to fund two existences on a single, dwindling income. There were gifts, medical appointments, and the looming, staggering cost of a potential divorce in a state like Connecticut. In Richard's mind, a divorce didn't just mean a split, it meant the unraveling. It meant Connie's family, those people who had treated him like a son, finding out who he really was. It meant this center of gravity he had helped build would collapse, and he would be the one standing in the rubble. Yet even under this crushing pressure, Richard's most remarkable trait remained: his ability to maintain appearances. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, he was still the perfect Rick. He went to the holiday parties. He helped with the decorations. He kissed Connie goodbye in the morning. He performed the role of the devoted husband with such precision that not even Connie, with her intuitive nature, saw the storm on the horizon. This is the most chilling aspect of the Dabate case. It wasn't a crime of passion fueled by a sudden argument. It was a crisis of management. Richard was trying to solve a problem of overlapping schedules. He was looking at his life like a failing IT system that needed a hard reset. While Connie was holding one life together with every ounce of her strength, planning the Christmas meals, tracking her steps, loving her children, Richard was maintaining another. A life that existed quietly alongside her, growing larger and more demanding with every passing hour. He had spent months keeping these two worlds from touching. He had built a fortress of digital deception to ensure the woman in the bedroom never met the woman on the phone. But as the sun rose on December 23rd, the fortress was failing. The silos were full. The clock had run out. And on that morning, beneath the festive lights of Birchview Drive, those two realities finally violently collided. December 23, 2015, began like any other Wednesday for Connie Dabate. The air in Ellington was biting, a typical New England winter morning where the frost clings to the windshields and the breath of the early risers hangs in the air like smoke. Connie was in motion by 7:30 a.m. Her routine was a series of well-worn grooves. She dressed, she checked on her boys, and she prepared for her morning exercise. This was her time, a spin class at the local YMCA. At 8:46 a.m. she left the house, the garage door rumbling shut behind her. To any neighbor watching, it was the picture of suburban peace. A mother heading out to start her day, unaware that the countdown on her life had already reached its final minutes. Richard's morning, by his own account, was also ordinary. He told investigators he left for work around 8:30 a.m., but realized halfway there that he had forgotten his laptop. He turned the car around, a mundane mistake that would, in his telling, place him in the house at the exact moment a nightmare began. According to Richard, he returned home at approximately 9 a.m. He claimed that as he entered the house, he heard a noise from the floor above. When he went to investigate, he was confronted by a scene out of a horror movie. Richard described a tall, muscular intruder. He said the man was dressed in camouflage, wearing a mask and armed. In the quiet halls of their colonial home, Richard claimed he was overpowered. He told police the intruder forced him into the kitchen, where a struggle ensued. But it was Richard's description of the intruder's voice that would later become one of the most discussed details of the case. He didn't just say the man spoke, he gave the man a persona. Richard would later describe the intruder's voice as deep, specifically comparing it to the actor Vin Diesel, or a character from an action film. It was a detail provided with total earnestness. In Richard's narrative, this wasn't a faceless shadow. It was a cinematic villain with a specific vocal register. While Richard was allegedly being restrained, Connie returned home. She had realized her spin class was cancelled and doubled back. Richard claimed he screamed for her to run, but she didn't hear him. She headed for the basement, the location of the family's gun safe. Richard told investigators he heard a single shot ring out from below. He claimed the intruder then turned his attention back to him, using a blowtorch to inflict small burns on his skin and a needle to prick his limbs. He described a calculated, almost theatrical torture. Eventually, Richard said he managed to activate the home's panic alarm, scaring the intruder away. By 10:11 a.m., Richard placed a 911 call. When emergency responders arrived, the scene was chaotic. They found Richard on the kitchen floor, partially zip-tied to a folding chair. He appeared distressed, his clothes disheveled, pointing toward the basement. Downstairs, in the dim light of the cellar, police found Connie. She had been shot twice, once in the stomach and once in the head. She was dead. The initial response was one of massive mobilization. A manhunt was launched. K-9 units were brought in to track the Vin Diesel-voiced intruder through the woods of Ellington. The community was terrified, doors were locked and parents kept their children inside. The narrative seemed clear: a home invasion gone wrong, a husband traumatized, a wife lost. Investigators spent hours interviewing Richard, documenting his wounds and processing the forensic evidence of a struggle. On the surface, the story held the weight of tragedy. It had a beginning, a middle, and a horrifying end. Initially, investigators believed the explanation was complete. The victim was identified, the suspect was described, and the motive appeared to be a random act of violence. But as the sun began to set on December 23rd, the detectives started to look at the clocks. Not the ones on the wall, but the ones inside the machines. And they realized that for Richard's story to be true, the laws of time and physics would have to bend. Because while Richard was telling his story, Connie's wrist was telling another. In the early hours of the investigation, the Fitbit One was just another piece of personal property. To the first responders, it was a piece of jewelry, a small, purple plastic clip attached to the waistband of Connie Dabate's gym clothes. It was an overlooked detail in a basement filled with the wreckage of a life. But as detectives began to piece together Richard's Vin Diesel timeline, they ran into a problem of synchronization. Richard's story was a series of rapid-fire events: the intruder, the struggle, the shooting, all occurring shortly after 9 a.m. By his account, Connie was gone before the morning news had even ended. But digital footprints are difficult to erase. Detectives seized Connie's Fitbit and sent it to a specialized lab. They weren't just looking for a GPS map, they were looking for a pulse. They were looking for this silent witness that doesn't feel fear, doesn't tell stories, and, most importantly, doesn't lie. When the data was extracted, the investigation didn't just change, it shattered. The Fitbit showed that at 9:18 a.m., the exact moment Richard claimed the house was under siege by a masked man, Connie's heart was still beating. Her steps were steady. At 9:27 a.m. she was still moving. At 9:45 a.m., nearly 45 minutes after Richard claimed she had been shot, Connie was walking. Not running for her life but walking. The device recorded her moving a distance of 1,217 feet within the confines of her own home. Imagine that distance. 1,200 feet. It is the distance of 4 football fields. It is the movement of a woman going about her morning, perhaps checking the laundry, perhaps walking to the kitchen, perhaps simply living the final, peaceful minutes of the routine she loved so much. The data provided a hauntingly precise map of her final hour. It showed her activity finally, abruptly ceasing at 10:05 a.m. Richard's timeline said she died at 9:05. The Fitbit said she lived until 10:05. That 1-hour gap was the space where the Vin Diesel intruder vanished. In that hour, there was no camouflage-clad stranger. There was only Connie moving through her home and Richard, who had sent an email to his boss from the home computer at 9:04 a.m., the very moment he claimed to be fighting for his life. This is the cold reality of the digital age. A person can be a master narrator. They can weave a story so detailed, so specific, that it captures the imagination of an entire town. They can give the villain a voice and the hero a struggle. But technology does not interpret events. It records them. The Fitbit didn't care about Richard's charisma. It didn't care about the zip ties or the blowtorch burns. It simply counted the steps of a woman who was still alive when her husband said she was dead. It held on to those 1,217 feet of movement like a sacred trust, waiting for someone to ask it for the truth. For the investigators, the Fitbit data wasn't just evidence. It was Connie herself, speaking from beyond the digital veil, pointing a finger at the only other person in the house. The timeline Richard had carefully constructed hadn't just been challenged, it had been deleted. There is a specific sound to a lie when it hits a wall of fact. It isn't a bang, it's a stutter. Armed with the digital logs from Connie's Fitbit, investigators returned to Richard Dabate. They didn't lead with the data. They followed the golden rule of interrogation. Give the subject enough room to commit to their story before you introduce the contradiction. Richard remained consistent. He was still the grieving widower, still the victim of the Vin Diesel-voiced intruder. He walked them through the struggle again, the camouflage, the blowtorch, the terrifying moment in the basement. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he was the only living witness to the morning's events. But then the detectives began to ask about the time. Not in hours but in minutes. They asked him to account for the gap between 9:05 and 10:05 a.m. They watched as Richard, the IT professional, the man of logic, began to realize that the system was recording something he hadn't accounted for. When the Fitbit data was finally laid on the table, the room went cold. Richard was faced with 1,217 feet of movement that shouldn't exist. He was faced with the reality that while he claimed to be zip-tied to a chair, his wife was walking through the house for nearly an hour. This is where the psychological unraveling begins. Under investigative pressure, the narrator doesn't usually collapse into a confession. Instead, he begins to adjust. Richard's explanations began to compress. He started to suggest that perhaps his memory of the timing was off. Maybe the struggle lasted longer. Maybe the intruder stayed in the house, stalking Connie while Richard was incapacitated. But the more he adjusted the story to fit the Fitbit, the more the other evidence began to scream. Investigators pointed to his computer. At 9:04 a.m., the very moment Richard claimed to be wrestling for his life, an email was sent from his IP address to his supervisor. They pointed to his cell phone, which showed him checking his sent folder during the alleged home invasion. The Vin Diesel intruder was being squeezed out of existence by the very technology Richard used every day. The interviews grew longer. The air in the room grew heavy. Detectives leaned in, pointing out that no K9 unit had picked up a scent of a stranger in the woods. No neighbors had seen a camouflage-clad man running through the quiet suburban streets. There was no shattered glass on the outside of the house, only on the inside. Richard sat in the center of a web of his own making. He was a man who had spent his life narrating his way out of trouble, but he was finally facing an audience that was checking his footnotes. Yet even as the walls closed in, Richard didn't break. He maintained his innocence with a chilling, quiet resolve. He leaned on the complexity of the technology, suggesting the Fitbit was faulty, that the GPS was wrong, that the digital world was a lie and his Vin Diesel story was the truth. Most people expect a smoking gun moment, a dramatic breakdown where the truth finally pours out. But in the Dabate case, the truth didn't come in a flood. It came in a slow, agonizing crawl. The police had the data. They had the motive. They had the inconsistencies. But they also had a man who was prepared to wait. A man who believed that if he could just hold the narrative long enough, the world would eventually look away. The investigators walked out of that room knowing they had their man. But they also knew that in the state of Connecticut, a digital footprint is one thing, a conviction is another. The questions had been asked. The interviews were over. But for Connie's family, the answers, the real final answers, would not come quickly. In the world of true crime, we are used to the fast version of justice. The arrest, the trial, the verdict, all neatly packaged into a single hour. But real life is rarely that efficient. For the family of Connie Dabate and the town of Ellington, the end of the interrogation wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a long, agonizing haunting. Between 2015 and 2022, a strange and uncomfortable silence settled over Birchview Drive. Despite the mountain of digital evidence, despite the Fitbit silent testimony, Richard Dabate was not immediately put behind bars. He was arrested in 2017, but due to a series of complex legal maneuvers, a massive backlog in the Connecticut court system, and eventually, a global pandemic, Richard remained out on a $1 million bond. For 6 years, the man accused of orchestrating his wife's murder lived among the people who had mourned her. He was seen in grocery stores. He was spotted at local parks. He continued to raise his sons. To some, this was the ultimate insult. A man living a normal life while Connie's voice was relegated to a digital file in a prosecutor's cabinet. To others, the delay created a toxic fog of doubt. If the evidence was so airtight, why was he still walking free? The town of Ellington divided quietly. People stopped making eye contact at the post office. Conversations in coffee shops would die down when a certain name was mentioned. The community was trapped in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a gavel that never seemed to fall. But the true weight of this limbo was carried by Connie's family. Imagine the endurance required to celebrate 6 Christmases knowing the primary suspect in your daughter's death was opening presents just a few miles away. For Connie's parents and siblings, justice wasn't just delayed, it was a daily, grinding test of their resolve. They watched their grandsons grow up in the shadow of a narrative they didn't believe. They attended every hearing, every procedural meeting, sitting in the back of cold courtrooms only to be told the trial was being pushed back again. They were living in a world where the center of gravity was gone, and the person they held responsible was still the one narrating the aftermath. This is the part of the story the headlines often miss. The limbo is where the secondary trauma happens. It's where memories begin to fade, where witnesses move away, and where the Vin Diesel intruder story begins to feel, to some, like a distant, strange myth rather than a debunked alibi. Richard's defense team used this time to their advantage, questioning the reliability of the Fitbit technology. They argued that electronic footprints weren't as reliable as physical ones. They waited for the world to forget the specifics of 1,217 feet and 10:05 a.m. But truth has a way of remaining patient. While the world changed, while the years turned and the children grew, the data inside that small purple tracker remained frozen in time. It didn't age. It didn't misremember. For 6 years, the question for everyone in Ellington wasn't what happened. Most people had already made up their minds. The question was when, or if, certainty would finally arrive. The silent witness had done its job in 2015. It would take until 2022 for the world to finally listen. Justice delayed is often justice denied. But in the case of Connie Dabate, the delay only served to prove one thing: that you can run from a timeline for 6 years, but you can never outrun the truth. In April 2022, the 2,331-day wait finally ended. The trial of Richard Dabate didn't take place in the shadow of a Christmas tree or the silence of a basement. It took place in a brightly lit courtroom in Rockville, Connecticut. For the family of Connie Dabate, this was the moment they had spent 6 years rehearsing in their minds. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of unarguable math. They didn't just tell a story, they built a digital cage. They brought in experts from Fitbit to explain the movement data, and IT specialists to walk the jury through the logs of the home computer. They presented the Vin Diesel intruder story not as a terrifying reality, but as a cinematic script written by a man who had run out of time. The defense fought back by attacking the technology itself. They called the Fitbit data unreliable science, questioning if a device designed for fitness should be used to determine the moment of a person's death. They leaned on the chaos of the morning, suggesting that in the fog of war minutes are easily misplaced. But as the trial unfolded, the focus shifted from the machines to the humans in the room. Connie's parents sat in the front row, day after day, absorbing the clinical descriptions of their daughter's final moments. They didn't look for a spectacle, they looked for accountability. They watched as Richard sat at the defense table, the same man who had shared holiday meals with them, the father of their grandsons, now appearing as a stranger defined by data points and contradictions. The legacy of this case wasn't just about a gadget. It was about what that gadget revealed about the human heart. The prosecution highlighted the mistress, the pregnancy, and the $475,000 life insurance policy Richard tried to claim just 5 days after Connie was buried. They showed a man who wasn't just living a double life, but a man who was willing to destroy the center of gravity to keep his secrets safe. After 5 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury reached their conclusion. On May 10, 2022, Richard Dabate was found guilty of murder, tampering with evidence, and making false statements. The narrative he had spent 6 years protecting had finally collapsed. In August, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. The judge's words were sharp, noting that Richard had brutally murdered a woman who trusted him. But the most powerful moments weren't the judge's sentences, they were the victim impact statements. Connie's family didn't speak of the Fitbit. They spoke of the 2 boys who had lost a mother. They spoke of a daughter whose routine was an act of love, not just a set of steps. The legacy of the Dabate case is often cited in legal textbooks as a landmark for digital evidence. It changed how prosecutors look at wearable tech. But for those in Ellington, the legacy is far more personal. It is the story of a woman whose own body of work, her steady, consistent, reliable life, provided the evidence needed to bring her killer to justice. Richard Dabate will likely spend the rest of his life in a cell. But for Connie's sons, the legacy is a mother whose truth was stronger than any fiction her husband could invent. We often look at our lives as a series of grand moments, weddings, births, the big decisions that define our future. But the case of Connie Dabate teaches us that the truth of who we are lives in the quiet, mundane repetitions of our days. Connie didn't know that her morning spin class or her 1,217 steps through her home would one day be the most important evidence in a murder trial. She was simply living. She was being the dependable, consistent person she had always been. In the end, Richard Dabate's downfall wasn't a forensic slip-up or a DNA match. It was his inability to account for the simple, beautiful predictability of the woman he married. He built a story designed to shock, filled with cinematic villains and high-stakes drama. But he was defeated by the ordinary. He was defeated by a purple plastic clip that recorded a woman walking through her house, doing the thing she always did. There is a chilling lesson here about the overlooked details. In our digital age, we are surrounded by quiet witnesses. Our phones, our watches, our smart homes, they are constantly observing the rhythms of our lives. They don't have an agenda. They don't have secrets. They simply hold a mirror up to our reality. For the town of Ellington, the cost of the truth was high. It cost 6 years of waiting. It cost the peace of a community. And for 2 young boys, it cost the innocence of their childhood. But there is a heavy kind of grace in the fact that Connie was the one who provided the answers. Connie Dabate was a woman of routine. And in the final hour of her life, that routine became her testimony. It was her final act of motherhood, leaving behind a trail of data that would eventually protect her children from the lies of the man who took her away. As we look back on this case, we are reminded that truth often reveals itself slowly. It doesn't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes it arrives one step at a time, recorded on a wrist, waiting for the world to catch up. Stories like this remind us that truth often lives in the details we overlook. If this documentary made you reflect on the power of consistency and the hidden narratives in our daily lives, share your thoughts respectfully below. How do you think technology is changing the way we see justice? Thank you for spending this time with us. If you value carefully told stories that honor the victims and seek the truth, consider subscribing. Until next time, pay attention to the details. They might be saying more than you think.